The Supreme Court has set an execution date for a man convicted of killing a Missouri highway patrolman back in 2005. Lance Shockley will be put to death October 14th.
After sitting on death row for 16 years, the state of Missouri has finally decided that Lance Collin Shockley must die. His date with death is set for October 14th, 2025, a quiet Tuesday morning inside the gray walls of the Potosi Correctional Center, where the air always feels colder and time has long stopped meaning anything. For almost 2 decades, Shockley has lived in the shadow of what he did, the night he changed the course of 2 lives forever. But before he became inmate, on 12/3/456, before the headlines called him a cop killer, he was just a 28-year-old man from Van Buren, Missouri, a small town tucked between winding rivers and thick forest, where everyone knows everyone, and secrets don't stay buried for long. What began as a drunken drive on a November night would spiral into a cold-blooded murder of a respected state trooper, a man whose only mistake was doing his job. This is the story of how a fatal crash, a guilty conscience, and a desperate plan to silence justice would send one man straight to Missouri's death row, and why, after 14 long years, the state believes it's time to finish what the courts started. On the chilly evening of November 26, 2004, the quiet town of Van Buren, Missouri, would witness a tragedy that would later spiral into one of the most shocking crimes in the state's history. That night, 29-year-old Lance Collin Shockley climbed into a truck with Jeffrey Bayless, his sister-in-law's fiancé. The 2 men set out for a drive in Bayless's pickup, but what began as a casual night out quickly turned deadly. Somewhere along the rural roadways outside Van Buren, the truck lost control and crashed violently. When the twisted metal settled, Bayless lay dead. Shockley, though injured, crawled out of the wreck and ran. When troopers from the Missouri State Highway Patrol arrived, the wreckage told a grim story. Sergeant Carl Dwayne Graham, Jr., a respected 12-year veteran of the patrol, led the investigation. Inside the truck, officers discovered open beer cans, a bottle of tequila, and a blood smear high on the passenger side wheel well, an unsettling sign that something more than an accident might have occurred. Shockley's sudden disappearance and inconsistent statements soon made him a prime suspect in what was shaping up to be a possible case of involuntary manslaughter. Months passed, but Sergeant Graham didn't let the case go cold. He continued pressing forward, piecing together evidence that pointed increasingly toward Shockley's guilt. It was March 20th, 2005. A calm Sunday evening in Van Buren, Missouri, a small town wrapped in the kind of silence you only hear in rural America. Sergeant Carl Dwayne Graham, Jr., a 37-year-old state trooper and 12-year veteran of the Missouri Highway Patrol, had just finished his shift. He was tired but proud. The man had built his reputation on integrity, fair, calm, and known to everyone who drove those lonely highways. He pulled his patrol car into the driveway of his modest home. Inside, his wife and children were waiting, the smell of dinner filling the air. But just as Graham stepped out of his vehicle, the night cracked open with the sound of gunfire. The first bullet hit him from behind, severing his spinal cord at the neck. It dropped him instantly, his body collapsing onto the pavement. 2 more shots followed, one tearing into his face, another into his shoulder. It was swift, calculated, and merciless. By the time his wife ran outside, Sergeant Graham was gone, his blood spilling onto the concrete of his own front yard. The killer vanished into the darkness. In the hours after Sergeant Carl Graham's murder, chaos and disbelief gripped the Missouri State Highway Patrol. One of their own, a man they admired, had been executed right outside his home. Investigators swarmed the quiet neighborhood, combing through every inch of the crime scene. The picture that emerged was chilling. Whoever killed Graham knew exactly when he'd be home, where to wait, and how to disappear without a trace. There were no signs of forced entry, no stolen items, no random gunfire. This wasn't rage. It was premeditation. Detectives began retracing Graham's final cases. Every file he touched, every suspect he questioned, every name that had crossed his desk. One name kept surfacing: Lance Collin Shockley. Just months earlier, Graham had been investigating Shockley's involvement in the November 2004 fatal car crash that killed Jeffrey Bayless. Shockley had fled that scene, leaving Bayless's body in a truck littered with beer cans and a tequila bottle. Inside the patrol office, Graham had already drafted a report recommending that Shockley face charges. That report never made it to court. When police questioned residents in Van Buren, several neighbors recalled seeing Shockley's red pickup truck driving through the area on the night of March 20th. It wasn't enough for an arrest, not yet, but it was enough to narrow the focus. Investigators also discovered that Shockley had a growing paranoia in the weeks before the shooting. He'd told friends that the cops were out to ruin his life. 3 days later, on March 23, 2005, officers moved in. Shockley was first arrested for the hit and run, then later linked to Graham's murder after forensic testing matched shell casings from the scene to a rifle found near property connected to him. When questioned, Shockley denied everything. He said he'd been home the night of the murder watching TV, unaware that a state trooper had been killed. But investigators weren't convinced. They'd seen the pattern, the motive, the timing, the fear. It all pointed one way. By the end of March, prosecutors charged Shockley with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. The very next day, the state filed notice that it would seek the death penalty. The news tore through Van Buren like wildfire. People couldn't believe it. That someone local, someone they'd seen at the gas station or fishing by the river, could have killed a state trooper. For the Graham family, it was the beginning of a long and painful road. For Lance Shockley, it was the start of the path that would end on Missouri's death row. It took 4 long years for Lance Collin Shockley to stand before a jury. 4 years of motions, venue changes, and legal wrangling. The case had torn through Van Buren. Too many people knew the Graham family, too many wanted justice, so the trial was moved to Howell County to ensure fairness. When the proceedings finally began on March 22, 2009, the courtroom was heavy with emotion. On one side sat the Graham family, quiet but unbreakable. On the other, Shockley, 32 years old, dressed in a pressed shirt and tie, showing no visible reaction. Between them stood a question that had haunted Missouri for years. Did Lance Shockley really execute a state trooper to save himself from a manslaughter charge? The prosecution laid out their story first. They described how Sergeant Graham had identified Shockley as the prime suspect in a fatal hit-and-run that killed Jeffrey Bayless. How Graham's report, days from being finalized, threatened to destroy Shockley's future. And how, on March 20, 2005, Shockley decided to stop the investigation in the most violent way possible, by killing the man who led it. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence, ballistic matches, and eyewitness accounts of Shockley's truck seen near Graham's home that night. They painted a picture of a man desperate to avoid prison, a man who thought silencing a trooper would erase his mistakes. The defense told a different story, that there was no direct evidence tying Shockley to the scene, no fingerprints, no eyewitness who saw him pull the trigger. They insisted the state was building its case on assumptions and public anger. For 5 tense days, the courtroom heard both sides. On March 26, 2009, the defense rested. By the next afternoon, the jury had deliberated for just 3 hours before returning a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The Graham family wept quietly as the judge read the verdict. One relative whispered, "Thank you, Lord." But the trial wasn't over. The jury now had to decide Shockley's fate: life without parole or death. Hours passed. Arguments rose, opinions split. In the end, the jurors could not agree. Under Missouri law, when a jury deadlocks on punishment, the final decision falls to the judge. On May 22, 2009, Judge David Evans looked at the man standing before him, the man convicted of killing a state trooper, and pronounced the sentence: death. Shockley didn't flinch. No tears, no anger, just a blank stare. Outside, Missouri's Attorney General called the decision appropriate and fair. Inside, the Graham family finally exhaled. Justice, they said, had been served. Shockley was transferred to Potosi Correctional Center, Missouri's death row, a concrete world of narrow hallways and locked steel doors where men wait years, sometimes decades, for the day the state calls their name. For Lance Shockley, that day would not come quickly. He would spend the next 16 years fighting for his life through a maze of appeals, while the memory of Sergeant Carl Graham lingered over every courtroom he entered. Death row in Missouri is a place where time stretches like an endless hallway. For Lance Collin Shockley, it became his new reality. A 6 by 8 foot cell, concrete walls, and a narrow window that looked out onto nothing. Days turned into years as he waited for a miracle that would never come. His lawyers began filing appeals almost immediately. They argued that the jury had been misled, that evidence was circumstantial, that the sentence was excessive. But in the eyes of Missouri's High Court, the case was clear. A state trooper had been ambushed and killed in cold blood, and the evidence pointed squarely at Shockley. In 2013, the Missouri Supreme Court reviewed his first appeal and rejected it. The justices upheld both the conviction and the death sentence, ruling that his trial had been fair and that his own actions had led to Graham's death. Shockley's next move was to reach higher, to the U.S. Supreme Court. But in 2014, and again in 2016, the nation's highest court refused to hear his case. Still, he kept trying. In 2017, he filed for post-conviction relief, but Judge Kelly Parker dismissed it. Then, in 2018, the Missouri Supreme Court agreed to hear one more appeal. For a brief moment, Shockley believed the tide might finally turn, but on April 16, 2019, the court handed down its decision, appeal denied. His conviction and death sentence would stand. By then, Sergeant Graham had been gone for 14 years, but his memory was still alive inside the Highway Patrol. Officers who once trained under him still wore black bands on their badges whenever they spoke his name. His family continued to attend every hearing, every update, refusing to let time dull the pain. On March 31, 2025, Shockley's final hope vanished. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected his last appeal, the end of a 16-year legal battle. That same day, prosecutors filed a motion with the Missouri Supreme Court to set an execution date. 3 months later, on June 25, 2025, the court issued a death warrant. The order was simple but final. Lance Collin Shockley will be executed on October 14, 2025. For the Graham family, it was the moment they had waited nearly 2 decades for, a sense that justice, long delayed, was finally closing its circle. For Shockley, it marked the end of a slow, silent countdown. 14 years after being sentenced, 16 after the murder itself, Missouri had decided that the time for appeals was over. The time for accountability had come. October 14, 2025. After 16 years on death row, Lance Collin Shockley now waits for the sound of footsteps that never come lightly, the ones that lead a man to his death. In the stillness of his cell at Potosi Correctional Center, time has run out. Outside, the Graham family prepares for a different kind of mourning. They've carried his absence for 2 decades, birthdays missed, an empty seat at the table, a husband and father stolen by a bullet meant to silence the law. For Missouri, this execution is not about vengeance. It's about closure, the long echo of a trooper's last steps finally meeting justice. As the clock nears midnight, the chapter that began with a single gunshot in 2005 is about to end the same way, quiet, final, and written in the name of Sergeant Carl Dwayne Graham, Jr.